Okay, all right, let's officially start today's event one more time. For those of you who just joined, I'm super happy to welcome you all to our tonight's event, Experimentation for Product Managers. And our today's guest speaker, Joaee, who is a product manager at Mercari and has a very interesting background in data science and has been building AI machine learning products. But I'm pretty sure that Joaee has a page of his self-intro in the beginning. And today we are talking about a very interesting topic, not only for product managers who are actually working as product managers, but maybe for those of you who are interested in diving in this industry, experimentation. And from what I've heard, Joaee prepared a very interesting slides explaining what is experimentation, how product managers can take an advantage of it, and a lot of cool insights. All right, so without you would like to start, Joaee, the floor is yours. Feel free to go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sasha. And exactly like you said, I do have a slide to add on a little bit more about myself. So I'm just going to start just to talk a bit more about what I do. So I'm a product manager at Mercari. For those of you who are signing in from Japan, I hope you probably know who Mercari are, but for those of you who don't, Mercari is a marketplace where it's a C2C marketplace where essentially kind of anyone can buy and sell used items, used or new items, just on the secondary market, so not from the primary market. We started in 2013 and we've grown quite fast. We have about 20 over million users now. Before moving into the talk itself, maybe I'll share a bit more about like the personal side of me. So I'm based in Tokyo. I've been based here since 2020, kind of right before the whole Corona stuff happened. Prior to that, I was in the UK for about 10 years working at a consulting firm in data science, which Sasha kind of alluded to at the start. I was working at PwC in their AI lab, building essentially kind of like AI ML products. Firstly, back in London, but then also for a few years in Japan. Cool. So that's me. And I just want to reiterate what Sasha said at the start, which is this is meant to be like a meetup, not so much like one-way talk, I think. So if anyone wants to kind of join the discussion, do just like type something in the chat. I've got it on my screen here so I can look at it. But Sasha, if I miss anything, feel free to kind of like prompt me if someone is saying something and I'm ignoring them. And also, if there's a natural pause in the presentation, I also don't mind if you guys want to just like unmute the side and talk, but only if it's a natural pause, like try not to interrupt me if you can. Cool. Right, so let me jump to the presentation proper and kind of give you an overview of what we're going to talk about in a bit more detail. So Sasha already mentioned, it's kind of about fermentation, but the kind of angle that I'm going for specifically is that it's going to be primarily a non-technical discussion. And what I mean by that is more that it's a non-statistical discussion. I'm not going to be going through any math, and the kind of thesis for this talk actually is that I find that there's a lot of literature online already about like how you do an A/B test, like how do you calculate statistical significance, like how do you make sure there's no like ratio mismatch, whatever, the kind of stuff, right? But then actually more on the practical side of using experiments to build products, I feel like that's a bit of a gap and kind of what I hope is more helpful to the audience here today. Cool. So I'll first kind of cover what is experimentation. I think with a lot of buzzwords, there's a lot of different interpretations. You ask 10 people, you might get 10 different answers. So I just want to clearly define it for the scope of this discussion so that we're on the same page about what we're talking about. And then I'll move on a bit more about like why we do it, which is also really important, because some people, like a lot of companies now want to do data-driven product development, and A/B testing is kind of like, oh, we have to do A/B testing, but you sometimes lose sight of why you do it, and in that, I think it's important to keep that in mind so that you're really leveraging experimentation for the powerful tool that it is. And then I'll move on to like how we do experiments, and that's sort of the meat of the session, really. It might sound a bit theoretical at first, so I'm going to try and follow that up quickly with like a kind of case study, like an actual case study of one of the experiments that we did recently at Mercari, and try to apply those lessons with the example. And I kind of hope that here actually, I don't know how successful we'll be, but I'll try and like ask for feedback and ask for people to kind of like comment about, you know, what they think the right answer is and things like that. So do try and join in if you don't mind. And then finally, I'm just going to end up with just a few discussion points about the practical side of experimentation and what I see like trips me up as well, about running experiments and how to use it effectively for product development. Cool. So firstly, what are experiments? So I think a lot of the audience here are probably fairly familiar with product development or certainly software development as a industry, right? So I want to start there as the context and say that experiments are a part of the development process. And I know it sounds kind of obvious now, but quite often I do think that people think experimentation is the aim in itself. It's not. It's part of the development process, and it should fit into your product development process. Because if it doesn't, you know, you're maybe satisfying your intellectual curiosity by doing experiments, but you're not like going anywhere, right? So what I have on screen now is sort of 5 stages of product development, which most people will be familiar with. I'm sure your team has some version of this. Maybe the words may not be exactly the same, but it'll be familiar. So starting from the left, you have some sort of discovery phase where you talk to your users, do some research, UX research, or data research to try and understand the problem better. And then you move on into like designing an actual solution. You might go through a few iterations of this. And then once you've landed on something that you're fairly comfortable with, you then finally build it. And here at kind of step 4, before the final step of releasing it to customers, that's where experimentation fits in. And I think this is where I think it's kind of the norm now at most big companies, but maybe at smaller companies, you might release immediately, and that's fine if you don't have enough traffic, for example, or if you're really a super high growth phase and you want to like prioritize speed. But in terms of when we talk about data-driven product development, experimentation is that step before releasing. So it's not after releasing, it's before. And it's where you want to essentially test that what you've built is helping you advance your goals. Right. And to kind of build on this point more, experimentation is part of the development process, but it's also learning with purpose. It's not just another stage gate in your release process. Like that's also another thing that I hear quite a lot. Like, oh, usually senior leadership says we have to be data driven. We have to do A/B testing, and then A/B testing just becomes this, another stage that you have to get through before you release. But it's not. It's really a way to help you improve in a targeted manner, and through the lens of experimentation. What an A/B test is, right? Essentially, you have a hypothesis and you want to test whether it's correct or not. And everything before that is forming your hypothesis. So when you're doing your discovery stage, when you're talking to users, you're starting to have an idea of what the problem is, and then what the solution is, right? As you go into a design stage and through the different iterations, you're starting to get, your fuzzy problem starts to become a bit more clear. And that's actually your hypothesis that's being formed. You have a hypothesis about the way the world works and that the way your product is going to solve that problem. And until you test it in an actual experiment, you don't actually know whether that is true or not. And to further drive the point home completely, I want to emphasize that experiments are not just a tactical tool. Like, it is a tool, part of the product manager's toolbox, and there are a lot of it, but it's also a very strategic tool. It's not, I guess, another sort of anti-pattern that I see is that teams want to try, 100 different things and then experiment with all of them and see what works. And that's not how, that's better than not doing experiments, but it's not making full use of experimentation, right? So experimentation is learning with purpose, and you should have this sort of feedback loop from once your hypothesis has been tested, like you update your prior model of how the world works and where your product fits into the world. And it's that feedback loop that helps you shape your strategy. So your product roadmap sort of becomes more or less clear with each hypothesis that you've proven or disproven. So for example, if you've finished an experiment and you found that your hypothesis about let's say personalization is true, it's something that helps the thing that you care about, then you might have the confidence now to kind of double down on this theme and invest more into personalization across your group. So to summarize, experiments shape your product roadmap. It's a tactical tool, but it's also a strategic tool. Cool. So that was kind of what experimentation is. And now I'm going to talk a bit more about why we do experiments. And it is not because, you want to be data-driven, so you have to do A/B testing, right? In a nutshell, without experimentation, it's really, really difficult to know whether what you're doing is working or not. What I have on the screen now is a graph from, so there's this website called Spurious Correlations. It's run by this guy, Tyler Vegan. The URL is there. It's quite a fun site if anyone wants to go and check it out. But what he does is basically collects these pairs of data in the wild. So this is all real data, and he's got hundreds and hundreds of examples on there where completely random things have very high correlation. So in the example that I've randomly picked one over here, but the one that I have is showing divorce rate against margarine consumption. So the x-axis goes from 2000, it's the yearly axis from 2000 to 2009. The red line is the divorce rate, and the black line is the amount of margarine being consumed. And as you can see, the correlation is really high. Actually, it's close to 1. It's almost a perfect correlation. And if someone presented this graph to you, without the legend, you might think that, well, you might think that to save a exactly right, you want to save a broken marriage, switch to butter or something. But we all know that that's not true, right? Like, anyone with sense of like how the real world works knows that that's not true. And just the fact that if you check out the website, just the fact that there's so many of it in the wild tells you how easy it is to think that something is correlated, but it isn't. And that's actually kind of a statistical feature, right? The more pairs of data they look at, the chances of a random thing appearing non-random increases. And also, maybe just to share a couple of stats from the industry. I don't have any sources for this, but if you Google it, you quite easily find a few research papers around like online experiments. And I think most of the big tech companies, less than 20%, maybe 10% of experiments actually generate any positive results. And speaking from experience, that sounds about right as well. So I would say it's definitely less than 20% of experiments work. And like, these are big tech companies, right? This is like Google and Microsoft. And those teams are not building new features randomly. Like when they invest into a new product, they have a pretty good idea with pretty good research backing it up that it's going to work. Yet 80% of the time it doesn't work, right? So that should tell you that we really don't know anything. Like, we as humans, we try our best, obviously, to bet on high probability successful ventures, but we really don't know anything until you test it. So that's why we do it, right? It helps us make sure that all the hard work that your engineering teams are putting into building something is actually being made to use. Awesome. So we've covered what experiments are, why we run experiments, and we're about 20 minutes in. So I'm gonna, the next section is kind of like how to run an experiment, which I think is the meat of the session. So before I jump into it, I actually want to maybe just pause for 30 seconds and see if anyone has questions. Are there any unclear points at all?
Oh, yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to write in the chat. And meanwhile, if someone has questions and type in, I throw my quick question that I have been typing to you. So on the first slide, you put experimenting to the place where the testing usually I've seen before. Does it mean that experimenting is very similar to testing in this case?
So I guess there are various forms of testing. You mean like user acceptance testing, end-to-end testing, that kind
right,
of
like
stuff?
checking if you don't have mistakes and like bugs and all kinds.
Yeah. Good question. Maybe that's my non-engineering background coming through now. So there's definitely that like software testing, and that is 100%. So that I actually think that's part of the build process. Like within you basically don't build anything, or at least the build isn't done until it's tested, right? So within build, for me, that's where you do the software testing, like making sure that it actually works. Whereas experimentation is more like hypothesis testing, whether you know that what you've built works, but the question is, does it impact your users in the way that you expected it to? Thank you. That's a good catch. It's probably, I should clarify that.
Yeah, thank you. Right, looks like everything is clear. Oh yeah, we have a question from Victor. Joe, could you please read the question just in case for you two people who can't see the text?
Yeah, so thanks, Victor. Will having more data reduce the chances of them being wrongly correlated with feature? If yes, is it a viable solution to just go for having as much data as possible? So yes and no. So I think what you're getting at is the chances of basically making a false conclusion when you look at more pairs of data. So for example, if I ran an experiment and I thought it would improve like some kind of conversion rate, but instead of just looking at conversion rate, I might also look at click-through rate. I might also look at the number of return visits. I might also look at the number of purchases, something like that, right? So in that sense, if you look at more data in that sense, it's true that the more data that you look at, the chances of being wrongly correlated with feature increases, and that's that's sort of what this slide is talking about, right? But But that's a different problem. And I'll go into that later actually when I talk about how you run your experiments, where you need to be very clear and very focused about what is it you're testing for. So your goal metric should be limited to ideally one, but I know sometimes go up to 2, 3, 4, 5, but definitely not more than 5, right? Like as focused as possible so that you don't have this chance of drawing a false conclusion. But in terms of having more data, in terms of the size of the data, more is always better. So going for more data generally actually reduces the chance of drawing a false conclusion. So you want, for example, in the example where you're doing some experiment where you look at conversion rates, you want as many users doing it, both in all of your variants, as many users as possible, and that is always more is better. Hope that clarified the question, but that's a good spot. Cool.
I think we're good to go.
Thanks. By the way, thanks everyone for thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Victor, for questions. I think that really makes the session more fun for me. So thank you. All right, now how to run experiment. So again, I've got this, I don't know what is it with the number 5, but this sort of 5 steps of how you run an experiment. Starting from the left, firstly, it's defining your metric. I'm going to talk about it in a bit more detail later, but I'll just run through the high level steps first. So firstly, it's defining your metric. Second, you want to design the experiment, like how will you actually run it? And then you finally conduct the experiment. After conducting it, you analyze the results, and then you decide whether or not you want to release it. So in the first step, defining the metric. And here, I want to emphasize that for product managers, this is the single most important thing for you to do. And the reason goes back into my earlier point about why we run experiments. Because experiments should be a targeted way of advancing your strategy. And that is manifested entirely in the metric that you're measuring. And if you get that wrong, it's sort of like you're moving forward in the wrong direction, right? So even though you're moving forward, you're not progressing. But if you get this right, then even if you move slowly, even if even if your experimentation infrastructure isn't super quick, even though you're doing things manually, even though you do many failed experiments and your success rate is 5% instead of 20%, even though your progress may not be fast, at least you're moving in the right direction. So this is the single most important thing to do. And everything else, you can learn, or things like designing the experiment, how you actually calculate whether there was a lift or not. Those are things that I believe you can work out. But defining the metric is the number one priority. So what is the metric actually? So it's basically what you care about, right? It's the actual hypothesis that you're going to test, and what is going to be measured, and whether or not it's higher or lower than your control. That might have sounded like a mouthful. I hope that makes sense, but if not, I'll kind of, thank you. So I know that wasn't very clear. So usually metrics are, the most common example would be like a conversion rate. So let's say you have a website and you want to convert visitors to your website to become purchasers of your website. So your metric could be, what is the conversion rate of visitors to your site into buyers? And that's actually a pretty common one. Other famous examples that I can think of. So for example, Facebook, right? They had a super famous number of friends they added in 10 days, like 7 friends in 10 days. So like percentage. So again, it would be like percentage of users that added 10 friends within 7 days. Right? That's what the metric is. And I hope it'll become a bit more clear as we go through the case study together later. And then a couple more helpful questions to sense check or ask yourself whether you've picked the right metric. It's actually quite complicated. I'm oversimplifying it a lot, but one good way, at least for me, that I always ask myself is, if this experiment is successful, does it advance my strategy? Like, do I now have greater confidence that the product strategy that I've built is working? And if the answer is no, then I think you kind of have to ask yourself why you're running the experiment, right? You're not just testing random things for the sake of it. So once you've defined the metric, the next step is then, I guess, a bit more tactical, a bit more logistical. Defining the metric is kind of the strategic view, and next is you get into the logistics of it. So this is where I think there's a lot of literature online. So I didn't want to kind of go into like mathematical detail, but at a high level, I think the things that we need to consider as product managers are, number one, how good does it have to be? And I think this is also something that is overlooked a lot. So it's the concept of practical significance, which if people want me to, I can explain a bit more later on. But essentially, it's knowing that the experiment or the thing that you're going to test is significant, not just statistically, but also practically. So you're actually taking into account, the cost of what is this new thing that you're building, the long-term maintenance cost of releasing it to users 100% long-term, and how much of an uplift do you need to see between your second variant and your control variant in order to justify the cost of actually doing the experiment. And it's really important to do this at the start, because if that fails the practical significance test, just save yourself the trouble and not do it now, rather than getting to the end of the process and then decide and then realizing that the cost is too high. And then more logistical, what are the specific logistics? So who are you actually going to show your test to? Like, which users are you going to include in your test? It's something called trigger analysis. That's it's sometimes not obvious, because a lot of products are complicated and there are many pathways to get to a certain point. So it's sometimes not obvious who will actually be exposed to your experiment, and you need to kind of just make sure you're crystal clear on this, right? So in this step, essentially, you want to err on the side of making everything foolproof and really saying in words, who exactly, when exactly, how are they going to see your experiment? And then the final thing, which I kind of asked myself, and this is where I was kind of thinking about how to explain the different like tests that data scientists would go through to validate the results of an experiment. And ultimately, I think for me, it's just, is the test fair? So, in the very basic nutshell of experiment, you have, let's say, an A/B test, you have 2 variants, right? And the most important thing to make sure is that they're fair, that when you compare the results of the 2 variants, you want to know that any uplift was entirely attributed to the experiment that you designed and not from some other imbalance either in the environment or somewhere in your experimentation platform. Again, I know that sounds very theoretical and it might be difficult to absorb right now, but I really hope that the case study will make this clear. So next one, you want to conduct the experiment. For product managers, I actually think this is the simplest step. You don't have to do anything really. You are probably using some sort of platform, either whether it's built in-house by your engineering team, or you're using some sort of third-party software like Optimizely or something, and you don't really need to do anything. But for product managers, I think one common habit is people are anxious to see the results of experiment, so they often look at the results early, and this is called peaking. And I've seen really often that people would, let's say your experiment runs for 2 weeks, people would sort of monitor the trend of how your experiment is doing, and they might say, oh yeah, during the first few days there was a noticeable uplift in the metric, but then towards the end it sort of went down. So we think that this is a good experiment, and even though it wasn't there was an uplift, now we want to try it again because there was a trend upwards. But that's wrong. That's not statistically valid. So the best thing I think to do for your sanity as a product manager is to just ignore your experiment until it ends. That just don't even bother looking at the results while it's running. Cool. And then finally, you want to analyze the results. So as I've been talking about in this super simple example, if you have a 2 variants and you compare them, your first one's your control, and your second is some sort of treatment variant that you've wanted to test about, right? And then you just see whether or not it is better. Of course, there are saying that whether or not it did better is probably oversimplifying it as well. You do need to kind of like validate whether or not it works. But again, tons of literature online. If you just Google like robust A/B testing or whatever, you'll find loads. And anyway, you'll probably be working with a data analyst or product analyst on your team anyway who can help with this. This last question, what is the overall estimated value? I think this is something that product managers don't do enough. And what I mean here is usually you've defined a metric that you care about in the first step, right? And then you measure in your treatment variant whether or not it did better than your control variant. And that's usually, for example, some sort of conversion rate, but it's not a comparable number with other teams. So for example, Sasha, when you asked the question that I talked about doing conversion rate for purchase rate, basically, right? That may be what I care about, but there might be another team who are also, implementing features on the same page, on the same screen of your product, and they might be worried about something completely different. For example, they might be worried about let's say they're like the social team, like they have this grand strategy on how to make your product more social. So they want to look at sort of a metric around the number of social media shares, for example. And sometimes those things come into conflict. And I think what's a nice way of resolving that is to actually convert your conversion rate into value. And this value should be a shared idea across your entire product team. So everyone knows what value is. It's usually revenue, but not always. And it's really useful because you can then start to compare experiments across different domains and be able to prioritize your features across groups. And also another add-on point about doing this calculation. Sometimes, most times, your experiments don't affect all your users. So you might implement a feature that you only want to release to a segment of your users. For example, people that sign on within the last 30 days, for example. And that's a smaller segment. And you might have a lift of, say, 20%, which is huge, right? Within this smaller segment. But actually, if this segment is really small compared to your whole population of users, that 20%, when you kind of dilute it to your whole segment of users, may only be 1 or 2%. And in which case, again, because features are released for all of your users, you need a way to be able to prioritize those conflicting trade-offs with other teams. So this is something that I really encourage product teams to think more about. And I think it's not common. I see that is a comment in the question. Thanks, Natasha. Picking is interesting. Curious how you limit our biases under pressure to complete the experiment ASAP. Our biases can weaken the results of the experiment. Yeah, completely. Like, I completely get it. Everyone wants to know how the experiment is working. So I don't know what works for other people, but for me, I honestly just ignore it. Like, I just don't look at it at all. Like, you obviously, there's nothing wrong with looking at results before an experiment as long as you don't draw any conclusions from it. But being human, I think it's really, really hard to draw any conclusions from it if you've seen it. So at least my tactic for dealing with this, and I don't know if it'll work for you, but for me, is to just ignore it completely. Like, run the experiment and just don't look at it until the end of it. But I should probably caveat that only works if you have some sort of automated alerting, because you do need to know if it goes bad. So I'm kind of thankful enough to have that. But if you don't, then you probably need to make sure that, if you suddenly your metric drops by 50% in one day, you need to be able to react to that, and then you have to look at it. But if not, build some sort of automated alerting system, and then you can ignore it and maintain your sanity. This is how I do it. Cool. And then finally, it's deciding whether or not you want to release it. And the question to ask is, was it worth it, right? Like, what was the actual impact of the result? What you expected, greater or less than what you expected? If it's greater, then it's probably worth releasing. I want to make one point here, which is that it's incredibly helpful to actually, in your design stage, to already be thinking about all of your different rollout scenarios here. So although this is the point where you decide, before coming here, you should already know that, for example, if your treatment variant performs better than your control variant, you will release it. Or if your treatment variant has an uplift of greater than 5%, you will release it. Or if, for example, maybe this was just a test and you need to reinvest into something before you can release it properly, you should already know, okay, if my treatment variant goes up by more than 5%, we will do X, Y, and Z. And the reason why you should do that during the design stage is, firstly, speed. You definitely want to be able to just react to experiments quickly. But for me, what I find benefited me a lot is reducing decision fatigue. And I don't know if this is a common problem for product managers, but like, the job is dealing with a lot of trade-offs, and you're often making a lot of decisions all the time. And personally, I find like all of this debate and discussion about whether we should do something, it's really tiring. And it almost sort of goes against the principle of why you do experiments, right? So if you've already defined this early on, once you get here, it's kind of no-brainer. Look, we already said we'll do this in this scenario. So we can just do it. And finally, do you need to clean up code? Again, another thing that I feel is not common enough. Again, there's a lot of pressure once you've shown a successful experiment, people want to put into production so that you can reap the benefits of the hard work, right? Completely natural. But at the same time, I hope everyone's familiar with the whole idea of MVPs and testing quick. So experiments are very much part of that. Experiments are a testing tool. So often you test with the easiest, fastest way that you can, because if 80% of experiments don't work out anyway, it doesn't make sense to be investing top quality code into it. Like this is where I would recommend racking up technical debt. Like that is good if it allows you to test things faster. But once you know that it is useful and that you want to make this a permanent feature of your product, then you should probably have a conversation with your engineering team whether it's ready to go into the wild as it is, or if you need time to clean up the code and things like that. And most often, the answer is yes, and the product team just doesn't ask the engineering team whether they need to. So highly recommend doing this as well. Great. So those were the steps for how to run an experiment. I'm going to move into the case study next, but and thank you everyone for those of you who have been posting your questions in the chat. This is really good to see the engagement. I'm going to pause again for maybe a minute and a half to see if anyone wants to clarify anything.
Maybe grab some water. Joaee, you okay?
That's yeah. Thank you. That's actually why I wanted to break. All right, I've had my water. Let's do the case study. And I think actually doing the case study is probably going to make the earlier section make more sense. It's hard to convey. I did say non-technical, but it probably is still somewhat technical concept. So this is a recent experiment that I did at Mercari. Disclaimer, like I did check with the company whether we could share this, but obviously I can't like go into specifics and tell you like exactly when we did it and like what the specific results are. But so I might make some things up, but this is like a real thing. Cool. So let me build the scenario for you, right? Imagine you're a product manager, okay, Mercari. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with the app, it's a marketplace app. So just like any marketplace, there is one step of the process is to get your items listed on the marketplace. So this is called like the listing flow. And as part of the listing flow, you have to select your shipping method. So this is how you will send the thing that you sell on the marketplace. So imagine you're a product manager at Mercari and someone comes up to you, someone from the AI team says, like, hey, I built this sort of AI model that predicts what shipping method our users should use. So they don't have to select it manually in the listing process. It can just be suggested to them and they can just like say yes, essentially, right? And again, to hopefully make it a bit clearer, on the left is how the app is currently. It's like a screen with a long list of different shipping methods that you can select. I should have made a GIF, but I was too lazy. So you can't see it, but you can, it's a really long screen that you can scroll down and for all sorts of different shipping methods that you can select. And then on the right, it's what your ML engineer, your AI team has come up with, which is when your user gets to this stage, this pop-up appears. I hope you can see it, but the black grayed out zone is the original screen. And then this white pop-up is what sort of gets popped up. And this is what your AI team is saying that, hey, we should totally do this. This is gonna make the listing experience much better for our users. Cool. So what I thought we could do is just look at time. So to be honest, I think the most important part is as I said before, defining the metric. So maybe we could spend a few minutes together as a group. This is where I hope everyone's rushing to type their comments and define the metric for this experiment together. So I'm going to try and facilitate this process a little bit. So maybe what did I? Okay, so going back to the hypothesis first, right? Like I'll start with an easy one. Can people just type like whether they think this is a good hypothesis or not a good hypothesis? Like yes or no, right? Thanks, Victor. I'll get to your comment later.
Just to clarify, you're asking people to write about the metrics, right?
Yes. Yes and no. So that's what I was. That is the final aim. I thought people might need like facilitation, but actually, if people are already talking metrics, let's just discuss it straight away. But I'll still give people a few seconds to type their ideas. So to clarify, yes, please suggest what you think the right metrics should be.
So we assume that people are familiar with the app and they know that what is the result, right? So you kind of, after this, what do you usually do after you choose the shipping method? Like, do you need to know the shipping? Like, do you need to know what is the result, like the outcome, in order to decide the metrics?
You mean what happens, the outcome in the app itself?
Yeah, like originally, like before experimenting, what happens?
I don't think that matters that much, but anyway, so basically you need to choose, just to give everyone the full context, yeah, you need to choose a shipping method, which is a required field. And then next there are a few steps, and then after this, at the end of the steps, you list your item. So that's when your item is actually put on sale on our marketplace. Okay, so I think we already have some examples, so I'll probably just start from there. But if anyone thinks of something else they want to discuss, feel free to put it into the chat. Like this is already really good, but more is better. Like more data is better. Cool. So before going into the examples, right, or rather, let me read out what people have been saying. So from Victor, for example, metric percent of people who quit at this step. That's really good. Looking quite strategically. Sasha talked about percent of people who went until the end, which I guess is quite similar, but kind of the inverse of it. And then Crystal talked about the time needed to finish listing, which is also really interesting. And then dropout rate, which I guess is similar to what we talked about, like churn rate. And we've actually considered both those things. So number of people who quit is like churn, and the time needed to finish listing. is something, well, we considered something, now I'm wondering how much I can share. But so we considered something really similar that measures time, but not just time needed to finish listing, slightly more. It's a derivative of that. And these are all really good examples, but I think I guess it was sort of like a trick question for me in that I think that this hypothesis that I started out is essentially not good enough. It's too vague, right? We say improve the listing experience, and already in the chat there have been two different definitions essentially of what listing experience means. So for example, churn rate could be an example of listing experience. So if you were to pick churn rate, what you're saying essentially is that a good listing experience is one where you finish it, which makes a lot of sense, right? If you complete the listing flow, you had a good experience. That's one hypothesis. And then another could be time, right? So a good listing experience is one where you finish it quickly. So that those are all valid hypotheses, by the way, and it really depends on what your strategy is. So what we actually ended up with, actually that's not true. I made this one up. So this is one of our sub-metrics that we measured. It's not what we actually measured in the end. And again, this is one of my tricks for trying to not share too much actual detail about the experiment. But what we actually ended up with was the percentage of users that list under 30 seconds, or 30 seconds is also not true, but that list under X a number of seconds. So it's really close to what Crystal suggested, which is measuring like speed, right? But again, all of those examples honestly are fine. It just depends on what your strategy is. If your strategy is to, at that time, our strategy was to make the listing experience simple. So we had this goal that we wanted everyone to list under 90 seconds. And I think actually in some parts of the app, you can still see like a prompt. If you're a new lister, you'll kind of say, oh, X number of users listed this item under 90 seconds or something like that, right? So that's something that we're proud of, and we've done like research to show that that's really correlated with actually getting new listers to list. But if for example, your strategy was, let's say you have a problem with the app and you know that you have churn rate, like a lot of people are interested in listing, but for some reason they don't complete the listing flow, then your strategy might be, we need to get people to complete the listing flow, and then you want to measure churn, and that's completely valid as well. So again, you need to link it to your strategy, and that's how you choose your trick. Cool, well done. So we just a few minutes left, and I kind of foresaw that we wouldn't finish everything, but I do want to just talk a bit more into the logistics step of it as well. So here in the design the experiment phase, I'd like to ask the group, which users, or I'll keep it super open-ended. People can just talk about what are the factors that you think you need to design for in the experiment. An example that I slipped up and said is like which users, for example. But what else can people think about? Or in fact, under which users, like what do you think the subset of users should be? Like which users should we show this to? Do we show this to all users? Some definition of a segment of users?
Wait, just to clarify the question, whom do we have to show this new shipping methods?
Yep.
I think Krista is working
because of yeah. So again, because we're running out of time quite soon, I'll just start going to the comments already. So random assignment, thanks Crystal, random assignment of treatment to new users. And then Natalia saying show it to all users. And again, I guess it's sort of a trick question because both are super valid, right? And again, it's linked to your strategy. So if you have a strong assumption, so a strong hypothesis going in, and this is sort of the hypothesis forming part of designing experiments, right? If you find that shipping is a pain point for new listers, for people who have never listed. So Victor just said people who send for the first time, right? So people who have never listed an item before. Say you've done some UX research, you've done some surveys, and you realize that people who have never listed before don't know what shipping methods to use. Then, again, because it's all connected, right? Then a more logical hypothesis to test is only show it to people who list it for the first time or to new users or people who have signed up in the last 30 days, something like that, right? But then if you've done research and you find that actually across the board, even with experienced users, shipping is a huge pain point. People don't know what to use because people are shipped, and this is actually true in Mercari where people ship a lot of odd size items. So even though you've used it 50 times, you might be first time you're sending a book, second time you're sending a table, third time you're sending like a bag, and it's all different. Then you might want to show it to all users. So I guess maybe kind of a trick question again, but everything is really valid, and it all depends on what your strategy is. You need to be thinking about what is the hypothesis you're trying to test for. Awesome. So thanks everyone. That's really helpful. I'm gonna kind of fast forward the case study now because I know we're already out of time. So that was the case study. I hope that was helpful for you guys to understand the more operational aspect of how to actually run an experiment. But I'm just gonna cap off here with the challenges that I found, again, on the non-statistical side of using experiments to build products. And as I go through them, you'll probably realize these are the points that I've been emphasizing a lot throughout the last hour because I think it's important, and I think it's the most overlooked side of experimentation. Firstly, unfocused experiments. So this sort of anti-pattern where people want to try 100 different things and then just see what works. You can do that, but it's a very kind of surface level use of experimentation, right? Really what you want is to have a strategy and be methodically working towards a goal. Second is using experimentation for optimizations only. Again, it's another sort of anti-pattern where some teams get really, really excited about adopting experimentation. They A/B test everything, right? Like every little change, when you change the color from one shade darker, you want to A/B test it. But then when they do like a bigger change, when they do a redesign, a site redesign, or when they release a new product for a new product line for a new subset of customers that you didn't service before, suddenly they go, oh, it's way too big. We can't A/B test it, so we're just not going to do it. And that's wrong. Like A/B testing works for optimizations, but also for bigger site changes. You just need to either break it down into smaller tests or run it for longer. But it's very situation dependent about which approach you should take. And next, kind of building on this point, which is using a one-size-fits-all approach. This I see happens a lot when people want to standardize the experiment so that they run it faster, and that's definitely something you should do. But just because something, how do I put this? So you might get something to work really well in a particular domain, but you often want to be testing things in many different areas of your product. So I would say, 80-90% of the time, your standardized approach would work, but just be careful of the 10% where you have to do something different. And it is okay to go off pace. Next, over-reliance on experiments for decision making, which is kind of, again, right, when you start adopting experimentation, you go too much into it, where it becomes the only way you make any decisions. But actually, that's not true. Some experiments, sometimes you don't need to do experiments, to be honest, where the answer is obvious and you already have really good evidence, qualitative or quantitative, you can sometimes skip. So again, it's more just a caution of, use it, but don't become blindly religious about it, right? And the last one is sort of my favorite one for product managers. This is called Toyman's Law, where essentially, if something doesn't look right, it probably isn't, right? Or like if something is too good to be true, it probably is. And here it's just whenever you get results, there's of course the statistical checking of results, which you should do. Or maybe your platform does it automatically for you, or your data science team does it for you. But you should also just, as a product manager, use your human brain and see, like, if you change the color of a button and you had a 20% uplift, does that sound right? If it doesn't, maybe you should look into it, right? And that actually saves people a lot of trouble, just by having that sense check. Cool. I think that is the end of my presentation, and I know we're 5 minutes over time, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to stay for a few more minutes as well.
Well, question time. Yeah, we have a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat for Joaee to answer. How often do you do experiments, Joaee?
All the time. Like, we have again, I don't know if we can say the actual number, but we have many experiments running all the time. So if you open if you use Mercari and you kind of take your version and you find a friend of yours and you open their version of it, it's not going to be the same. We're running like experiments all the time and across all surfaces of the app.
So I can understand, for example, like having a lot of experiments for a startup or some early venture. This is something that can be executed easily. But for example, for existing product, how difficult is to run experiment, without confirming it's on every stage?
Sorry, what do you mean by at every stage?
Like, for example, especially in Japan, right? If you want to introduce a change, you have to confirm, you have to get an approval at the every stage, right? Do you have that kind of thing at Mercari?
So I think that's one of that's very true. At Mercari, we don't actually. I think Mercari is a very strong data-driven culture, and our CPO, product officer, gives us a lot of freedom and autonomy to test things quite freely. So we don't have this sort of like, I don't have to get approval for this experiment I'm going to run. And that allows us to test very quickly. But of course, there's the risk of doing that. Like, you could, destroy the customer experience, right? Like if product managers are not careful. But a couple of ways that we combat against that is we share, more like peer-based sharing, with other product teams, like what are the experiments we're planning to run. And then people will just, if something looks like it could cause a huge degradation to the experience, someone will probably call it out. And also what I mentioned earlier about monitoring your results. So we use this concept of guardrail metrics, which I think is fairly common. So usually you look at goal metrics, which is the thing you care about and whether or not it's going to improve. But there's also guardrail metrics where you make sure things don't drop below a certain level. And that's how you kind of maintain the integrity of your product by making sure that whatever experiment doesn't hurt your guardrail metrics. And your guardrail metrics usually will be kind of baseline metrics that it's not part of a strategy, but it's just super important for, like, everyone knows it's important, right? Things like purchases, number of users, number of churn rate, things like that, hygiene factors.
Thank you. You have a question from Natasha?
Yeah, correct. Sorry for everyone in the group. Do you have experiments for iOS users, Android mobile users, Windows users, Mac users, etc.? Yes. So there are a few ways to go about this. Again, that goes into the design of experiment section, right? Like which users, also like which environments, right? Do you want to test only on iOS? Do you want to test only on Android? Or do you want to test only on desktop, only on mobile, or all of it? What I would tend to do is essentially, the bottleneck usually is traffic. So you want as much traffic as possible. So if you are testing something on desktop, for example, I think it doesn't matter so much whether you're testing Windows or Mac, unless it's you have some sort of hypothesis that the results are going to be different. But if not, you just want as big a catchment as possible. For mobile, however, iOS and Android do tend to have bigger differences. So at least on the teams that I've been on, we tend to test on one platform at a time. But I think if there have been cases where something applies equally to both, then you just want more users to test on both platforms. Yeah.
How long does usually an experiment run?
Good question. So in the design step, when I talked about practical significance, let's say your experiment, you expect it to improve your metric by at least 5%. And then, so this is kind of going more technical a bit, but there's something called power analysis, where essentially you calculate it needs to go up by 5%, and then you do reverse calculations for how much traffic you need to be able to detect 5%. And then once you know the number of users that need to see your experiment, based on your historic traffic rate, you can calculate how long it needs to be. For us, it's usually 2 to 4 weeks. And speaking to a lot of like other people in the tech industry, I think 2 to 4 weeks is fairly common, actually. Yeah.
All right. Cool. Okay, so we are slightly running out of time. So I believe we probably need to wrap up this talk to let you go enjoy your evening and probably have your dinner, and probably let our attendees have dinner too if they're in Japan. Do you have any last words you would like to say? Maybe like some promotion, something where people can maybe find you if they would like to ask any other questions, if they would like to connect, or anything that you would like to add?
Nothing in particular. I'm happy to kind of connect on LinkedIn if people want to discuss. Just do drop like a message. Don't just add me, because I might not know. Like, just say like, oh hey, met on the vegan meetup. Want to talk about X, Y, Z, whatever, and I'll be happy to connect. But other than that, not really. Just if you're interested in pursuing a career in product management, highly recommend it. I think it's super fulfilling. And if you're in Japan and if you're interested in Mercari, we're also always hiring. So check out hiring page. But other than that, use Mercari. I do think it's a fantastic app. I really believe in this mission of like a sustainable recircular economy where you don't buy new things, use someone else's old things and give it a new life. So use the app.
Do you hire junior product managers in Mercari?
No, we don't. That's the one.
We have a plenty of Levagon graduates who would like to pursue a product management path after graduating from the bootcamp. I wish I could recommend them to come to Mercari.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that we've been thinking about. So Mercari is fully remote. I think it's frankly, one of the barriers, I think, to hiring more junior product managers. I think as our company grows, we will at some point, but just right now, we're not really in the capacity to.
Cool. We'll be waiting for that moment. Let me know. Cool. Thank you so much, Joaee. Thank you so much for the cool presentation. It was very insightful. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, listening and also engaging in the conversation. It was nice to have you all and have a great evening. Have a rest. Finally, have dinner, probably. If you're in Japan, if you're in Europe, have a good afternoon. And sometimes we do have people joining us from America. Maybe good morning for those as well. Thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you again at our upcoming workshops. Thank you so much, Joaee. You're the best. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Sasha. Thanks, everyone. Have fun.